What I'm going to talk about today is prefacing some of the work that we've done at the national level in terms of trying to benchmark and capture basically the amount of variation that exists here throughout the United States. So I only have 20 minutes, and I only know a handful of you in this room, but those of you that know me know that 20 minutes is barely enough for me to get started on any subject. So I will move through this as quickly as I can, and then if you have any questions, let's just answer them as we go, because the way I see this, we are the last session of the day, so if we want to stop and talk and discuss through the way, we certainly can, and we'll just get started. So a lot of this started with the National Retail Benchmarking Audit, which was an audit that I headed up back in 2012. Recently just completed the second round of audits here, wrapping up mid-April of this year. So we're actually on to the second audit phase now of the National Retail Benchmarking Audit. And I can just give you a little bit of background of what it is, the reason for it. This was research that was funded by the National Pork Board, carried out by myself, Ohio State, I'm sorry if there's anybody there, the Ohio State University, Texas A&M University, University of Florida, Cal Poly. There was a pretty good handful of us, and also Penn State as well participated in that project. So we have multiple investigators. And here's really what this came down to is over the past 20 years, there's been a fairly good amount of quality work done, looking at genetics, nutrition, lots of variable that have been looked at over time. And more recently, there's been some projects done looking at consumer preference. Some of you may or may not be familiar with the Taste of Preference study that was conducted, Steve, in 2009, something around 2009. And essentially what the Taste of Consumer, the preference study looked at is variable factors that influence quality and how those factors basically carry over into consumer acceptance. So what do consumers want? Basically is what this says. When it comes to quality, what do consumers want? And some of the factors we traditionally look at in meat science and pork quality are the pH of meat, the color of meat, the intramuscular fat content of meat, and all of those characteristics, how they play over basically into palatability. So juiciness, tenderness, and flavorness. So Dr. Moeller and Dr. Miller, who conducted that trial, the Taste of Preference study, basically outlined what consumers prefer. And I've actually got a slide at the very end of this deck if you guys want to talk about that. But talking about what do consumers prefer, and essentially the challenge that was put out there by the National Pork Board after that from a research standpoint was, if we know what consumers prefer, then what are consumers offered? So how much variation exists, and taking into account, or rather taking out of account, some of the more traditional parameters that myself and Dr. Bowler do routinely, where we control everything. Where either we're controlling genetics, we're really controlling the model, we're controlling a lot of things that are involved, we're collecting that data at the plant. We know exactly how the animal was processed and chilled and handled, but this project really was not the goal of that. This project, the goal of this entire project was saying, when the consumer goes to a meat case, whether it's a box store or a retail store, whether it's the variation, and there's a lot of variation in packaging type, in case type, in days that it takes to get to the plant or to the retailer rather, what kind of quality variation exists. And so that led the base of why we did the benchmarking study. And really the reason why that we did that, the goal is to provide a baseline that we can build off of in the future. Right now we've had a lot of discussion about quality and areas of improvement that we can look at, but before you can do anything in terms of trying to quantify improvement, you've got to figure out a base of where you're at. And that's what this was. So just to familiarize everybody in here, I'm assuming assuming that some of you have discussed quality in the past, and this certainly is not a lecture on what is pork quality, but wherever the parameters I'm about to talk about, and it's just a handful of the parameters from that project, I'm really referencing this. These pork quality standards, which are published by the National Pork Board, and these are the routine measurements that we look at when we think about quality here in the United States. This is like pork quality wrapped up into one poster, essentially. And for those of you who aren't familiar, I'll just walk you through the baseline. This might help you whenever we get to some of the really boring stuff here in a second, the graphs. But essentially, we characterize pork here in the U.S. into 3 different classifications, and you see up here we have PSE, RFN, and DFD. So the very first part of every one of those acronyms is referencing the color of meat. So in terms of objective measurements, we do a lot of subjective and objective measurements for meat color, because meat's ability to have a lighter or darker presence in terms of color directly relates to the physiochemical factors that are associated with it. So a lot of the measurements we take in plant reference pH, the pH of muscle. So the color of pork is directly influenced really in the first 24 hours post-mortem once that pig is dead. So whenever we're talking about a characteristic of quality on its own, we're talking about the color of meat, whether it be pale, red, or dark. That middle one is talking about the pale, soft, and exudative. It's talking about the firmness of meat, talking about meat's ability. This also ties in the third acronym, talking about meat's ability to bind water. So pH, there's a lot of factors. This could go on for like a whole day if we were going to talk about the factors that drive PSE, RFN, and DFD. All you really need to know is anything pale, soft, and exudative is bad, right? Anything that's pale, soft, and exudative when cooked, it already has a lower ability to bind water. It already has lost a lot of exudate. So whenever you cook it, you're going to have a less enjoyable eating experience. Fair enough? So what we're really looking for is more of an RFN, and we're going to talk a lot more about these color marbling standards here in just a minute. How much time have I already used? Steve, tell me, 10 minutes?
8.
Okay, well that's great. Okay, so this is color. You just saw color? Just remember this, because I'm going to come back to this over time. What we have here are subjective color standards. That's the top number you see there, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. These are the standard subjective visual measurements that we take whenever we're classifying pork here in the United States. So these have been the standards for a long time. These are the cited measurements that are used to quantify the subjective pork color here in the U.S. And these higher numbers underneath, Minolta L star value, it says, are the close or approximate numbers. When it talks about L star value, we're talking about lightness of meat. So think about it this way. 0 to 100 is the scale, with 0 being pure black, 100 being pure white. L stars is a measurement that's actually taken by a measurement called a colorimeter. So if you ever wonder how they match a paint chip on your car, you take a paint swab into a retail store and they match it exactly. They do that using L star, A star, and B star. So they take all the color hues, they combine them, they give all of those an index value of 0 to 100, and they can come up with an exact color measurement. So we do the very, very same thing in meat. L star being one of the most important color indicators, because the darker the meat is, this is a pretty good rule of thumb, the darker meat is, the higher the ability it has to bind water, the increased chances that it's going to be juicy whenever you cook it, and you're going to have a more enjoyable eating experience. Darker is better. Just remember, darker is better. From a marbling standpoint, we use a very similar scale on 1 to 10, 1 being practically no marbling, 10 being a very high degree of marbling. So, from a benchmarking standpoint, what we're really looking for is kind of these optimal colors. And we could spend a long time talking about just color of marbling on its own. If you go back to that previous slide, what we really say is the ideal pork color is somewhere in that 3, 4, and 5 range of pork here in the United States. So a color score 3, 4, 5 being ideal. I didn't do the fancy box that I did here, see? Ooh, there we go. All right, so the big red box. Marbling, a 2, 3, or 4. That number is associated with the estimated percentage of intramuscular fat in the chop. So 2, 3, or 4 being what we call an optimal amount of intramuscular fat in terms of driving flavor. So in the pork business, and when you look at the taste of preference data, which I can certainly talk about, and I think maybe Dr. Bowler's talking about that afterwards, when we talk about marbling, marbling doesn't have a significant impact in terms of characteristics like tenderness, which is extremely important in pork. The same type of correlations that it does in beef. However, it does tend to, as consumers get a pork loin product that has a higher degree of marbling, they tend to have a higher degree of satisfaction in eating that chop. And I think that is fairly simple if you go back to the theory of fat equals flavor, right? So certainly if we got into some certain types of genetics, niche breeds, specialty programs, if you talk about the various number of domestic and international programs, these two factors I just talked about are essentially the base units for how all that product is sorted. So there is a high amount of pork, a very, very large amount of pork from here in the United States that is sorted based on color and based on marbling. Color being the primary indicator. We sort a ton of product now that goes into the food service market, and we sort a lot of product that goes into the international market. Certainly Japan is a key market of U.S. pork, and we have plants that have Japanese color score lines where we sort some of that product off for the export market where it can catch a premium. So it's kind of the basis of quality. Now let's get back to this retail benchmarking project. So what we looked at whenever we entered stores, we used a model that we developed for this project to basically say, how can we represent the extremely large number of retailers that exist in the U.S.? If you were going to take what we would call an adequate sample size, you'd be going into thousands of grocery stores. So that's not possible. So we developed a model that took into account the 52 different marketing areas that the United States is broken into. If you've ever looked at Progressive Grocer, they have a thing called the Marketing Guidebook. Some people call it the Blue Book. We use that book as one of our indicators of breaking the country out into retail distribution, the top retailers in every major market. So taking into account your big operations like Walmart, which would be a national brand, certainly club stores like Sam's Club, Costco, BJ's, but also taking into account some of the really large regional stores. So think about some, I'll give you Winn-Dixie. Right? Huge, not everywhere. H-E-B, you can't talk about a huge amount of meat that gets moved in H-E-B. H-E-B certainly doesn't exist in North Dakota. A lot of things don't exist in North Dakota, though, so I can use that joke all day long. All right, so we entered the stores, and we didn't just look at loins, but I'm going to give you loin data today for the sake of time. So we looked at blade steaks, we looked at sirloins, and we looked at pork loin chops, which is certainly one of the bigger indicators of quality that we get referenced in published literature all the time. Within the case, we did a full meat case assessment. So we looked at everything from the type of case, the type of packaging, all the products available. But when it really comes down to the quality measurements, we took 10 packages of every brand in the case. So I'll give you an example. If this was a retailer that carried Hormel product, they might carry 2 separate brands because they might carry Hormel Always Tender, which is going to be an enhanced pork product. They might carry Hormel Natural Choice. So we separated everything out by enhancement type to separate brands. So 10 packages, every brand, every store in the case. We did subjective color scoring, subjective marbling scoring, everything about the label, including cook temperature and everything in the case. So really saying, what is the consumer seeing? You see where I'm going with this? We're saying, what is the color in the case regardless of all the different lighting types, shelving types, and there is a huge amount of variation in terms of the variations that different retailers use. Then we took that product after we did the subjective color. These are those subjective color marbling scores on the bottom of this slide here that came off of that original large poster that I showed you. We gathered that product after we subjectively evaluated it. We put it on ice. We shipped it back to our lab, and there at our lab we took the product and evaluated it out of the package. So whenever you allow pork to bloom out of the package and you allow oxygen to be exposed to that product, you're going to get really what's for lack of better terms, called the true color. So you're allowed to take that product out of the packaging, see how much exudate you have. We cooked those products and sheared them, doing Warner-Bratzler shear force, which essentially mimics the amount of force in kilos that it takes to chew through a chop. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the Warner-Bratzler shear force system. And we collected all that objective data. So we talked about the LAB scores. We collected all that product data. And then we combined it into one large data set. So where did we go? It was 117 stores, 65 brands of pork, a huge amount of variation in terms of cooking. The big thing about this 5 temp recommendations, this is a slide that I've actually used in another presentation, and I had this in here because right after we started the benchmarking project in 2012 was just after USDA had approved the 145 to be used on labels. So we were kind of using this as a benchmark also to say how many retailers are still using labeling of 160, 155, 165, 170, there's a bunch. There's a lot of variation that still exists in this category, even though it is getting better. Across the bottom, we're not going to talk about that, but that's really just comparing modified atmosphere packaging to vacuum packaging to overwrap. You have to take into account the number of stores that are buying in box product, cutting it in store versus the large number of retailers that buy in case-ready product, and try to make sure that we're accounting for everything. So we try to capture all the variation that's out there. That's what I'm basically trying to tell you. So what did we find? This is, I have like four slides that basically outline what happened in this project. So you have to remember, this isn't a traditional scientific project where you have a ton of control. This is a benchmarking data. You enter, by the way, I didn't mention, we entered all of these stores within a very short time frame in order to take seasonality into account. Seasonality is a big issue when we start talking about quality parameters in the pork business. So we entered in all these stores between essentially the end of January and the very first day of April. So we took into account a winter time frame, worked out the best, especially when you're in North Dakota. I could bust a bunch of winter jokes if you want me to, but this right here is the frequency distribution of subjective color score. So what you have across the bottom is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, right? 1 being pale chops, more categorized into that pale, soft, and exudative category. 6 being dark pork. This is the frequency distribution of those chops. And if you look at the percentage of chops, you really end up with a fairly high median range. The median color score here is a 3.14. So 3.14, the average across the board. And these graphs, I really like to see it busted out by distribution. And you'll also notice over here on the right-hand side, this is segregated by enhancement type. So you can't classify them together whenever we talk about enhancement of pork, because for one, there's almost every processor has proprietary enhancement solutions. And 2, whenever you enhance a product with salt, phosphate, and otherwise, and water, certainly, you can change color, you can certainly change flavor, you can change a lot of the chemical properties of meat itself. So you have to distribute this stuff out in an enhanced and non-enhanced. So as you see, we really had kind of a wide distribution of color, but I'm going to show you what's important is the next slide. So this is taking into account, by the way, subjective color score in the case. So we look at the color score in the case. We've got an average of a color score 3, but still, if you'll agree with me, a pretty significant amount of pork that falls in the 3 and below category. So if I asked you, all of you shop in retail grocery stores, I'm assuming at some point in your life, would you disagree with me if I told you there was a lot of variation in the case? Okay, I doubt that you would. I don't think I've ever been challenged with the case of saying that there is a lack of variation that exists in the case, even though there are some retailers today that are starting to sort on color specs. So some of this quality stuff that we're going to talk about is getting more important over time. This slide right here, and I apologize for using, I'd much rather use pictures and not these bar graphs to explain this, but what this is the L-star value. I can't do that in 2 minutes. You told me we could go as long as we wanted. So this is the L-star value distribution of color in terms of the Minolta L-star value. So just think about this as being true color. So if we sorted this out into true color, and what I did is, just to make this easy from a presentation standpoint, in each one of these parentheses would be the associated based on the current National Pork Board standards. Those L-star values I gave you associated with color, these would be the color scores associated with that L-star value. So what you're really seeing is before, in this previous slide, a significant amount of pork is still falling into approximately 40 to 50% of that product is falling into that color score 3 category. Whenever you start looking at actual objective color measurements over time, we've got a significant amount of product that's actually falling into the category of 3 or below, regardless of enhancement type. So I'm gonna keep moving forward. This is actually the frequency distribution of marbling. Really, what I would say when I wrap this up is going to be, we've got a color issue. But especially when we talk about the large amount of variation that exists in terms of enhanced or non-enhanced pork and color in the case, from a marbling standpoint, I really wouldn't say that's the case. This is actually fairly acceptable, probably, and I'm giving my own personal opinion here. But we've got a large amount of that product that falls in the 2 to 3% range of intramuscular fat. And if you go back into published data and you look at loins and loin chops that have high intramuscular fat, this was some of the work that was done with Dr. Moeller's group and the Taste of Preference. That product was given to consumers cooked. So there is a difference of consumer acceptance of picking product out of the case versus having cooked product presented to them. So the higher degree of marbling, the beef industry has seen very similar results. If you put product out in the case, there is quite a bit of data that shows that your average consumer will pick select over choice out of the case and choose choice over select in a taste panel. So that's going to go back to a variety of factors. This is the tenderness values associated with what we found. This is where you really start to see the big separation. So you talk about enhanced versus non-enhanced pork. This is all cooked to the same degree of doneness, mind you. So whenever we do the Warner-Bratzler Shear Force, all this product is cooked exactly the same over time. And you can see these values that are presented down here are newtons. So that's what we have to present. And I just threw this number up here. Based on most of the published data, anywhere in that 24.5, Dustin, I added that this morning. Would you agree with that? Around 24.5. Anything below 24.5 is almost always uniformly characterized as tender. That's pretty tender. And anything over 24.5 newtons is characterized as starting to enter the tough side. So if you look, you can certainly see there's a big spread, especially whenever we talk about enhancement type of product that existed in the entire data set of tenderness associated with the Warner-Bratzler Shear Force.
Is there any correlation between marbling and tenderness?
Yes, there is, and that's actually what I was talking about earlier. I mean, there's an association, but it's actually not very high. So the correlation values aren't nearly as high as what they are with beef. With beef, you see a higher significance in terms of the correlation values between, as you go out of select into choice into prime, you see tenderness improve, and I think typically there's a tendency for that value to have increased tenderness values or decrease tenderness values with higher marbling. So the thing of pork is it's really about water holding capacity. It's really about color over time, and this is the basically. I have a lot more slides in this, but this was the final slide we plan to wrap up on, and that is, and this sentence sounds worse than it really is, but it's the final summary of what the project says, and that is that there's a lot of variation that exists. And if you break this stuff down into the actual properties of meat, there's a fairly significant amount of pork that fails to meet what we would call good eating quality standards in terms of tenderness, juiciness, and flavor. And it's going to give us a long roadmap of things that we can work on as we move forward. So.